In the summer of 1966, Saigon was supposed to be safe. The capital of South Vietnam, guarded by American firepower and South Vietnamese troops, stood as the heart of the anti-communist war effort. But just beyond the city's streets and markets, danger lingered in the villages only a few kilometers away. There, the Viet Cong collected taxes, spread propaganda, and recruited fighters under the very nose of Saigon's government. It was a haunting truth. The war wasn't only raging in far-off jungles and remote provinces, it was creeping right up to the gates of the capital itself. That June, the South Vietnamese Army launched Operation Lam Son, a mission to root out communist influence in two villages just outside Saigon. For the generals in Saigon, this was more than a military sweep. It was a test, a chance to prove that the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the ARVN, could stand on its own without always leaning on American combat troops. But as the Rangers moved in, villagers woke to the sound of boots and shouts, unsure whether to fear the soldiers in uniform or the Viet Cong, who would surely return when the operation ended. What unfolded over those tense days was not a massive battle, but a snapshot of the war itself. The clash between military power and political control, between promises of security and the harsh reality of living under two shadow governments. This is the forgotten story of Operation Lam Son, the sweep to secure Saigon's doorstep, and the deeper truth it revealed about the Vietnam War. Before we dive deeper into this story, did you know that almost 90% of you are watching without subscribing? Our goal is to reach 15,000 subscribers, and you can help us get there. Hit that button now so you never miss these forgotten Vietnam War stories. By mid-1966, the Vietnam War had entered a new and dangerous phase. Just a year earlier, the United States had dramatically escalated its involvement, pouring combat troops into South Vietnam in hopes of stabilizing a faltering war effort. American generals brought in the heavy firepower, artillery, helicopters, and B-52 bombers, while President Lyndon Johnson promised that U.S. strength would turn the tide. On the ground, however, the picture looked very different. South Vietnam itself was a nation under strain. Politically, the government in Saigon was weak and unstable. In just a few short years, coups and counter-coups had shaken the country. Buddhist protests filled the streets, military factions schemed for power, and the people in the countryside wondered whether Saigon could ever provide real leadership. Into this chaos stepped the Viet Cong. They were not just guerrilla fighters. They were also organizers, tax collectors, and political operators. By 1966, they had built shadow governments across the countryside, including the villages ringing Saigon itself. At night, they patrolled the hamlets. They issued warnings to villagers who collaborated with the government. They collected rice and money to fund their war effort. The Americans could fly bombers over the jungles of Laos and Cambodia. But in Gia Định Province, just outside Saigon, the enemy was winning the war of influence. For every battle the Viet Cong lost, they seemed to gain fresh recruits from villages that had lost faith in the South Vietnamese state. This was the dilemma facing the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the ARVN. On paper, it was the National Army of South Vietnam, supported by billions of dollars in U.S. equipment. But in practice, its reputation was shaky. Too often, ARVN units were seen as dependent on American forces for victories. Too often, villagers viewed them as outsiders who swept through with rifles and uniforms but vanished as soon as the operation ended. By 1966, the American presence was growing larger by the month, yet Saigon's own army was under pressure to show it could fight on its own. If the ARVN couldn't secure even the villages near the capital, what hope was there for South Vietnam's survival? This was the backdrop to Operation Lam Son, a pacification sweep launched in June 1966, not in the remote jungles of the Central Highlands, but in villages a short drive from Saigon itself. It was here, so close to the capital, that the war's contradictions would be laid bare. The villages chosen for the operation were Phuoc Loi and Tan Thoi, small rural settlements in Gia Định Province, only a short distance north of Saigon. On maps, they looked unremarkable. Clusters of thatched homes, dirt paths, and rice paddies stretching into the horizon. But for Saigon's generals, these villages represented a growing embarrassment. Despite being so close to the capital, they were effectively under Viet Cong control. The enemy's presence was not always obvious. During the day, Phuoc Loi and Tan Thoi looked like any other South Vietnamese villages. Farmers tended their fields, children ran through the hamlets, and local elders oversaw community life. But behind this calm exterior, Viet Cong cadres operated openly. They organized meetings, distributed propaganda, and quietly threatened those who defied them. At night, they were the true authority, while the government in Saigon was a distant, fading voice. The ARVN High Command decided it was time to change that. The mission was assigned to the 5th Ranger Group, one of South Vietnam's most capable formations. Among them was the 30th Ranger Battalion, a unit with experience in counterinsurgency operations. Unlike regular infantry, the Rangers were trained to move quickly, strike hard, and fight in conditions that blurred the line between conventional warfare and guerrilla skirmishes. The plan was simple on paper, but difficult in practice. 1. Surround the villages before dawn, cutting off any escape routes. 2. Move in with coordinated sweeps, searching homes, fields, and gathering places for weapons, documents, and enemy fighters. 3. Screen the population. Line up villagers, check their papers, and interrogate anyone suspected of working with the Viet Cong. 4. Arrest cadres, confiscate weapons, and secure the villages under government control. American support would be present but limited. Elements of the U.S. 1st Infantry Division would guard the outer perimeter and provide logistics, but this was intended to be an ARVN-led operation. Saigon wanted to prove, both to its people and to Washington, that its army was not just a junior partner in the war. This was more than just a sweep. It was meant as a political statement. Operation Lam Son 2 would show that South Vietnam could defend its capital, pacify its people, and stand as a nation capable of fighting for its own survival. But as dawn approached on June 2, 1966, and the Rangers prepared to move out, no one could ignore the deeper truth. The Viet Cong had been rooted in these villages for years. Clearing them in a few days would be one thing. Holding them would be another challenge entirely. At dawn on June 2, 1966, the countryside around Saigon stirred awake as it always did. The sound of roosters, the haze of morning mist rising from the rice paddies, farmers preparing for another day of work. But on this morning, something was different. Moving through the fields and along the dirt tracks were squads of South Vietnamese Rangers, their uniforms dark against the pale light. They moved quickly, silently, spreading out to form a tightening ring around the villages of Phuoc Loi and Tan Thoi. The operation began with precision. The cordon was established before most villagers had even stepped outside their homes. To the ARVN, surprise was everything. If the Viet Cong sensed the operation too early, they would slip away into the countryside, leaving behind only frightened civilians and hidden weapons. As the Rangers closed in, U.S. advisors watched from the perimeter. American helicopters hovered overhead, not firing, but scanning the terrain. Outside the cordon, armored personnel carriers from the 1st Infantry Division blocked the roads. This was not an American show of force. It was deliberately staged as an ARVN mission. But without American support holding the outer lines, the Viet Cong could have vanished into the broader province. Once the cordon was secure, the Rangers advanced into the villages. Boots pounded on packed dirt, rifle barrels swept doorways, and soldiers shouted commands as families were ordered out of their homes. Villagers, men, women, children, and the elderly, were herded into open gathering points for screening. For many, the sudden appearance of the Rangers was terrifying. Some feared that if they were too cooperative with the soldiers, the Viet Cong would return that night to exact revenge. Others resented the government soldiers, who represented a distant Saigon regime that often demanded loyalty but struggled to provide protection. And a few villagers, secretly working for the Viet Cong, calmly blended into the crowds, hiding their roles behind blank stares and silence. The sweeps themselves were tense. Soldiers moved from house to house, kicking open doors, searching under mats and storage jars, digging through piles of rice to find weapons or documents. Occasionally, a shout rang out as a hidden rifle was discovered, or a stash of grenades unearthed beneath floorboards. On the outskirts of the villages, brief firefights erupted. A handful of Viet Cong fighters, caught off guard, tried to slip out through the paddies. Bursts of gunfire cut through the still morning air. A few bodies fell, but most of the guerrillas avoided direct combat, fading into the tree lines beyond the ARVN cordon. By midday, the villages were firmly in Ranger hands. Civilians stood in long lines under the hot sun as South Vietnamese intelligence officers checked papers and photographs, looking for matches to known Viet Cong operatives. Suspects were pulled aside, interrogated, and in some cases, led away in handcuffs. On the surface, everything seemed under control, but beneath it all, there was an unspoken tension, a sense of impermanence. The villagers knew the Rangers would leave in a few days, and when they did, the Viet Cong would return, asking questions, demanding to know who had talked, and punishing those who had cooperated. For now, though, Lam Son too had begun, just as the generals had hoped. Swift, disciplined, and seemingly effective. The challenge would come in the days that followed, as the ARVN pressed deeper into the political and human battlefield that could not be won by rifles alone. By the second day of the operation, the villages of Phuoc Loi and Tan Thoi no longer felt like ordinary hamlets. Bamboo fences had been pulled down, families were confined to open squares, and armed soldiers patrolled every lane. What had once been quiet communities were now staging grounds for the ARVN's attempt to prove it could root out communist influence. At the center of it all stood the interrogation stations. Villagers were lined up under the watch of Rangers, their names taken, their faces compared against worn photographs of suspected Viet Cong cadres. Intelligence officers moved down the lines with notebooks and lists, asking sharp questions in clipped voices. Where were you last night? Who do you know in the next hamlet? Why is your rice harvest so small? For many civilians, these questions were frightening, not because of the soldiers in front of them, but because of the Viet Cong who would inevitably return once the ARVN withdrew. Answer too freely, and you risked your life later. Answer too little, and you risk punishment now. The Rangers arrested several suspects. One was an elderly man who tried to insist he was nothing more than a farmer. But in his house, soldiers uncovered propaganda leaflets, carefully wrapped in oilcloth. Another was a young woman who had slipped past the cordon on the first morning, only to be caught sneaking back in later with coded notes hidden in her basket of vegetables. Weapons caches were discovered. Rusty rifles, grenades, even homemade traps, buried in the ground beneath sleeping mats or hidden inside livestock pens. Each find was announced with a shout, soldiers gathering to haul the contraband into the open. For the ARVN, these discoveries were proof that their mission was working. For the villagers, they were proof of something else, that their quiet communities had long been battlefields, with loyalties and dangers woven into daily life. U.S. advisors observing the operation noted the careful balance the Rangers tried to maintain. Some soldiers were stern but restrained, determined not to alienate the civilians they were supposed to win over. Others, less patient, barked orders and shoved villagers into line, their frustration betraying the larger truth that trust was almost impossible to build in just a few days. By the evening of the second day, the Rangers had detained dozens of suspects. Some were almost certainly Viet Cong political officers. Others may have been guilty only of bad luck or old grudges whispered by neighbors. The line between enemy and civilian blurred with every interrogation. The official reports would count these arrests as successes. But for the villagers, the images that lingered were different. The sight of neighbors dragged away, the humiliation of being questioned in front of friends and family, the constant fear of what would happen when the Viet Cong inevitably returned and asked who had cooperated. In the fields outside the villages, bodies of a few fallen guerrillas still lay where they had been shot trying to escape the cordon. For ARVN commanders, they were proof that the enemy had been dealt a blow. For the villagers, they were reminders that their lives were caught between two worlds. Soldiers in the day, guerrillas at night, and no real escape from either. Operation Lam Son 2 was, on paper, unfolding exactly as planned. The Rangers had swept the villages, uncovered weapons, and arrested cadres. But the deeper struggle, the battle for loyalty, fear, and political control, was only becoming clearer with every passing hour. After 3 tense days of sweeps, searches, and interrogations, The ARVN High Command declared Operation Lam Son 2 a success. Official reports painted the picture clearly. Dozens of suspects detained, many identified as Viet Cong political officers or village cadres. Weapons caches seized, rifles, grenades, and propaganda material displayed as trophies. Villages secured, Phuoc Loi and Tan Thoi brought under government control, if only for the moment. For the South Vietnamese government, this was exactly the headline they wanted. Lam Son 2 showed that the ARVN could carry out an independent pacification mission so close to Saigon, without relying entirely on American combat troops. Newspapers in Saigon covered the story as proof that the government was taking back the countryside from communist influence. But behind the press releases, the reality was far murkier. American advisors were quick to notice the limits of the operation. Yes, the Rangers had moved efficiently. Yes, weapons were confiscated, but the Viet Cong's real strength was not in rifles hidden beneath floorboards. It was in the loyalty and fear of the villagers, carefully cultivated over years. That loyalty could not be erased in 3 days. Many of those arrested were undoubtedly active Viet Cong operatives, but others were caught up in a swirl of suspicion, old grudges, and misinformation. For the villagers left behind, watching neighbors dragged away only deepened resentment and fear. The greatest problem, though, was time. Operations like Lam Son 2 were temporary by design. The Rangers could sweep the villages, but they couldn't stay. After the soldiers withdrew, the Viet Cong would return, and when they did, they would ask questions. Who cooperated with the government? Who told the Rangers where weapons were hidden? Who stood too close to the soldiers in the square? Punishments for collaborators could be swift and brutal. In some villages across South Vietnam, suspected informants had been beaten, executed, or made examples of in front of their neighbors. Everyone in Phuoc Loi and Tan Thoi knew that once the ARVN pulled back, the night would again belong to the Viet Cong. Thus, while Lam Son 2 was presented as a tactical victory, it was a strategic illusion. The Rangers had proven their ability to sweep, search, and fight, but the South Vietnamese government had not proven it could hold or win the trust of its people. For the Americans, this operation became another reminder of a haunting pattern. Villages cleared during the day, enemy returning at night, civilians trapped in between. By the time the Rangers withdrew and the villages returned to their uneasy routine, the verdict was clear. Lam Son 2 had worked on paper, but in the hearts and minds of the people living there, the war was far from over. On the surface, Operation Lam Son 2 looked like progress. The ARVN had executed a clean sweep, captured suspects, and shown that even villages close to Saigon could be reclaimed from communist influence. For Saigon's leaders, it was a morale boost. For American advisors, it was at least evidence that the ARVN Rangers could conduct disciplined operations when properly directed. But beneath those surface-level results lay a pattern that was already defining the Vietnam War, the cycle of clear, leave, and lose again. The United States and South Vietnam had spent years developing strategies for what they called pacification, the process of rooting out Viet Cong influence and replacing it with government authority. It sounded straightforward. Sweep through an area, eliminate guerrillas, set up security, and win the support of the population. In practice, however, pacification was a nightmare. The Viet Cong did not rely on permanent bases or massive troop concentrations. Their strength was political as much as military. They built underground networks, cultivated loyalty from families, and ensured compliance through a mix of persuasion and terror. When ARVN forces moved into a village, the Viet Cong simply melted away. When ARVN forces left, they reappeared, punishing collaborators and reasserting control. Lam Son 2 was a textbook example. The Rangers had done their job well, tactically sharp, organized, and aggressive. But once the operation ended, the question remained: who would stay behind to protect the villagers, to reassure them that cooperating with Saigon wouldn't get them killed? Too often, the answer was no one. The ARVN lacked the manpower, training, and political structure to follow through on pacification. Even in areas just a few kilometers from the capital, the government's grip was fragile. For villagers, this reality bred cynicism. Why trust Saigon's promises if the Viet Cong were the ones who would be knocking on their doors at midnight? American commanders began to see that the problem was not simply killing Viet Cong fighters, it was winning control of the social and political battlefield. Guns could clear a village, but loyalty could not be forced at rifle point. And Lam Son, too, proved that without a permanent presence, military victories turned hollow almost as soon as the troops pulled out. In this way, the operation foreshadowed the central struggle of the entire war. The ARVN and U.S. could fight brilliantly in set-piece battles, but they struggled to convert those victories into lasting security. The Viet Cong, by contrast, could lose dozens of skirmishes and still maintain their influence because they understood the power of time, patience, and presence. So while Lam Son II was forgotten in the larger history of the war, it carried a lesson that echoed through the conflict. Wars are not won by temporary sweeps, but by permanent control. And in Vietnam, control was always slipping away. In the grand history of the Vietnam War, Operation Lam Son II is barely a footnote. It lacked the drama of battles like Ia Drang or Khe Sanh, and it was overshadowed by the massive American buildup unfolding across South Vietnam in 1966. But in its quiet way, Lam Son II revealed the very heart of the conflict and foreshadowed struggles that would continue until the fall of Saigon in 1975. For the South Vietnamese government, Lam Son II was trumpeted as proof that the ARVN Rangers were a capable force. It allowed Saigon to tell both its citizens and its American allies that the Army could carry out pacification missions on its own. But the truth was far less encouraging. The ARVN had demonstrated strength in short bursts, yet still relied on American support for logistics, outer cordons, and political cover. For the villagers of Phuoc Loy and Thoi, the operation was a bitter reminder of their daily reality. The soldiers arrived, searched, arrested, and left. The Viet Cong, meanwhile, returned when the uniforms were gone. This cycle deepened the feeling that no one could truly protect them, and that siding openly with either side carried deadly risks. In the years that followed, this same pattern repeated across South Vietnam. U.S. and ARVN troops cleared villages, counted body bags, and seized weapons, only to watch the Viet Cong re-emerge once the operations ended. The inability to translate tactical victories into strategic control would haunt both Saigon and Washington. And then there was the name itself, Lam Son, chosen in 1966 as a patriotic reference to Vietnam's 15th century war hero, Le Loi, and his uprising at Lam Son. The name would reappear 5 years later in a very different context, Operation Lam Son 719. In 1971, South Vietnamese forces launched a massive cross-border invasion into Laos, supported by American air power, in an attempt to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Unlike Lam Son II, this operation was not a small sweep near Saigon, but a full-scale test of whether the ARVN could fight a major campaign on its own. The result was catastrophic. Thousands of ARVN troops killed or captured, helicopters shot from the sky, and a resounding blow to South Vietnamese morale. In that sense, Lam Son II and Lam Son 719 were linked across time. The first was a small test of ARVN independence near the capital. The second was the ultimate test of ARVN independence in a foreign land. Both revealed the same truth. South Vietnam's army could fight hard in the moment, but without lasting political authority and support among the people, victories would crumble into defeats once the dust settled. Thus, the legacy of Lam Son II is not about the number of weapons seized or the suspects arrested. Its legacy is a lesson, whispered in the voices of the villagers who watch both sides come and go. Wars are not won by passing through. They are won by staying, protecting, and earning loyalty. And in that struggle, South Vietnam was already losing in 1966. Operation Lam Son II, carried out in June 1966, was not a battle of blazing artillery or massive troop maneuvers. It was instead a snapshot of the Vietnam War in its most revealing form. The struggle for influence in the villages, where loyalty shifted with the sun, and where victory could be declared in the day but undone by nightfall. The war was never just about clearing territory. It was about holding it, protecting it, and convincing people that the government they lived under could keep them safe. Lam Son II revealed how far Saigon was from achieving that goal. And it foreshadowed larger failures that would come later, when even bold operations like Lam Son 719 collapsed under the same weight of weak foundations. So while history books rarely dwell on Lam Son 2, its lesson endures. Wars are not decided only by how many weapons are seized or how many enemies are captured. They are decided by the silent calculations of ordinary people, asking themselves, who will still be here tomorrow? Who can I trust when the sun goes down? In 1966, just outside Saigon, the answer to that question too often favored the Viet Cong. And that reality, more than any battle report, explains why Operation Lam Son 2, and so many others like it, could never deliver the lasting victories Saigon and Washington so desperately sought. That was the story of Operation Lam Son 2, a small sweep outside Saigon that revealed the much bigger challenges of the Vietnam War. If you found this episode insightful, give it a like and share it with others who love forgotten history. Don't forget, we're on the road to 15,000 subscribers, and your support makes all the difference. Hit subscribe now so you won't miss the next untold story from this war. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.